There were many eyes on Lana Long as she walked out on stage for her nightly routine. She was a popular performer at the Sly Fox Lounge, a club well known for beautiful, exotic dancers. Sometime after the performance, Lana Long had an unexpected encounter. The crime committed that night might have gone unsolved had it not been for a common thread. One Sunday afternoon, two boys were playing together on an abandoned highway.
Ready? 3, 2, 1.
As they ran through a field chasing a parachute, they discovered a horrible sight. The nude, decomposed body of a young woman. She was lying face down with her hands bound behind her back. A cord was wrapped 3 times around her neck like a leash. Under her body lay a white silk scarf tied in a knot.
This killer was trying to make a statement. He could have killed this woman with a lot less trauma. But the deepness of this bruise, the prominence of this bruise, indicated that he applied a lot more force than it was necessary to end this woman's life. He was violent.
The victim was identified as 20-year-old Lana Long, an exotic dancer who worked at the Sly Fox Lounge in Tampa. Detectives found some faint tire tracks near the body, but little else. Homicide investigators interviewed Lana Long's boyfriend, John Corcoran. Corcoran hadn't reported Long missing, even though they lived together, and he hadn't seen her for 3 days.
He had an explanation of why he didn't report her missing. It was kind of vague. We were concerned about that.
Corcoran admitted that he argued with Long on the day of her disappearance about the number of men who were calling her at home, asking her out on dates. 2 weeks later, a second body was discovered in a deserted location.
I can vividly recall getting in the car, driving to the crime scene, saying to myself, please don't let her be bound. Please don't let her be tied up. It felt like a ton of bricks had just fallen upon me. Because here we go from rarely having a victim bound to now 2 within 2 weeks of each other.
The victim was identified as 22-year-old Michelle Sims, a former beauty contestant who had turned to prostitution to support a drug habit. Near the body, police discovered some fresh tire prints in the soft sand, but there was something unusual about the tire impressions. The vehicle had 3 different tires. Detectives made plaster molds of the tire impressions for analysis, hoping they would provide some clue to the identity of the murderer. Because of the similarities in these 2 cases, investigators believed that both murders were committed by the same person. This time, however, John Corcoran had an alibi and was no longer considered a suspect. In the forensics lab, when Michelle Sims' clothing was analyzed, they discovered a tiny clue, a mysterious red fiber. It was similar to a red fiber discovered at the Lana Long crime scene on the white silk scarf found under Long's body. On September 18, 1984, the nude body of a 3rd woman was discovered. The victim, 18-year-old Chanel Williams, who had a prior arrest for prostitution.
In this particular case, it was a black female. Her body had been dumped on the roadside. She was completely nude. She was not bound in any way. There was some clothing found next to her, tied in a knot. She had suffered a gunshot wound to the back of the head. So when you look at this case, it's totally different than the other cases, or is it?
The forensics lab found the answer. Tiny red fibers were discovered on Williams' clothing, fibers similar to those found on the other 2 victims. While detectives launched a full-scale investigation, they hoped that these mysterious red fibers would lead them to their serial killer before he struck again. The Hillsborough County Sheriff's Department wanted to know all they could about the mysterious red fibers found on the 3 murdered women. Each of the tiny fibers was microscopically analyzed and compared. Under a scanning electron microscope, magnified more than 1,000 times, scientists noticed an unusual size and shape to the fibers.
Instead of being round or square, the fiber looks more or less triangular, but like a triangle it's been pinched, so that you see the 3 legs sticking out from the core of the fiber.
The fibers from the 3 women were all triangular or trilobal. The next task was to identify whether the fibers were natural or man-made. Since man-made fibers are made from chemicals, scientists use what is called a melting point apparatus to determine the temperature at which the fiber would break down. The results revealed that the red fibers were nylon. And by microscopically measuring the light reflected through the fibers, scientists determined that all 3 trilobal nylon fibers were dyed the exact same color and were from the same dye lot. The conclusion: the red nylon trilobal fibers found on the 3 victims were all from the same source. Nylon trilobal fiber is used mostly in carpet, high durability, inexpensive carpet. Since this fiber masks dirt, it's often used in automobiles and hotels. Next, homicide detectives turned their attention to the tire impressions found near the bodies. Tire tread experts noticed that there were 3 different tires on the vehicle. The impression of the front tire was simple to identify. It was an extremely common model made by the Goodyear Tire Company. The right rear tire was manufactured by the Goodyear Company as well. It was a low-priced model called the Viva. But there was something unusual about the tread. It was a white wall tire and was on the rim with the white wall side facing inward. The left rear tire could not immediately be identified since it was not among the thousands of known tire treads in the FBI's computer database. So investigators sent the tire impression to the Goodyear Tire Company in Akron, Ohio, to see if they could help identify it. Goodyear's tire expert recognized that it was a specialty tire and a very expensive one, not sold in retail stores. It was a model called the Vogue, made by the Vogue Tire and Rubber Company, and was used exclusively on Cadillacs. The tire impression showed that it too was a white wall tire, which was placed on the vehicle with the white wall side facing inward. If the detectives could find the vehicle with this unusual combination of tire treads, they would have the vehicle which left the tire tracks at 2 of the murder scenes. They also suspected that this vehicle would have red nylon trilobal carpet. Gary Terry decided not to release this important information to the press.
Serial killers watch the news, read the newspaper just like anybody else. We were aware of the experience up in Atlanta, Georgia with the Wayne Williams case. I had personally talked with the investigators up there. He changed his pattern after he saw it described in the newspaper. He began reading about trace evidence. So he began dumping the bodies in the rivers to wash the bodies and destroy latent or trace evidence.
Deputies believed that the killer was cruising for victims along Nebraska Avenue, where prostitutes usually congregate. Female police decoys walked the strip dressed as prostitutes in an attempt to lure the killer. The number of patrol cars in the area also was increased. Author Anna Flowers described the search for the killer in her book, Bound to Die.
I've talked to a lot of officers who say, I have to think like the killer in order to catch him. I worry, what would it take for me to become the killer? Interesting thought.
Despite police efforts, a fourth nude body was discovered in a deserted area. The victim, 28-year-old Karen Din's friend, who had turned to prostitution to support a drug habit. Deputies knew that the serial murderer had struck again when they found red nylon trilobal fibers in Din's friend's clothing.
The pattern that we saw here, the way that these bodies were left, the way that they were strangled, the way that they were tied, indicated that we had a serial killer.
Despite leaving behind the fiber and tire track evidence, the killer was smart. But his next target, a 17-year-old girl, outsmarted him. 2:30 a.m. After working the night shift at this donut shop in Tampa, Florida, 17-year-old Lisa McVeigh rode her bicycle home along a dark, deserted street. Suddenly, a man jumped from behind a parked van, knocked Lisa off her bicycle, grabbed her by the hair, and forced her into his car.
God, help me. I was thinking I was going to be killed. Oh my God, just help me.
He drove McVeigh to an apartment. Over the next 24 hours, she was repeatedly raped and sodomized, blindfolded, petrified, and convinced she would die. Lisa McVeigh made an important decision.
I had the life of God in me. I had the willingness to live, to survive. That's it, the survival part. When you're in something like that, you would be surprised yourself what you're capable of.
While still blindfolded, McVeigh was permitted to use the bathroom. She left her fingerprints everywhere she could, under the toilet seat, around the sink, on the hairdryer.
If I had died, if I was killed, I want them, as far as the police or whoever found me, to know that I was there and I tried.
Lisa was a very sharp young lady. I personally feel what saved her life was her actions, and those actions were to say yes sir and no sir to every demand that the suspect made of her.
At 3 in the morning, after 24 hours of captivity, Lisa, still blindfolded, was forced back into the car at gunpoint.
She was very street smart. Although she had been blindfolded, she could see under the blindfold enough to give police very important data.
I was trying to get a good clue, idea of what area I was in. I wanted to know where I was coming from. And I remember leaning back from the chair, I could see in the blindfold that I saw two hotels side by side each other practically. Then the 275 goes in between them. It was a Howard Johnson and Quality Inn.
Lisa noticed the word Magnum on the dashboard, saw that the seats were white and that the car had red carpet. Her abductor stopped the car for a few minutes, and Lisa heard a familiar sound. A 24-hour bank teller machine.
I heard the sounds of the keys, of the buttons of the machine.
A short drive later, he stopped the car, opened the door, put Lisa on the street along with her clothes, warned her not to remove the blindfold for another 5 minutes, and drove away.
Freedom. Wow, I'm alive, I'm here, what do I do now? I looked both ways, and I fell to my knees and I started crying.
Lisa McVeigh was taken to the hospital and her clothing sent to the forensic lab for analysis. But before it could be analyzed, detectives were called to another homicide. Another nude body found near a highway overpass.
And you could tell it was him. There were actually no ligatures on the body, but you could see ligature marks where he had removed the ligatures.
When the forensic lab analyzed the clothing from Kim Swan and Lisa McVeigh, they discovered a shocking piece of information. Kim Swan's clothing contained the same red nylon trilobal fibers as the other victims, and the same red fibers were found on Lisa McVeigh's clothing.
It was disbelief. We couldn't believe that we have, for some reason, the killer has not killed. He's let a victim survive.
Lisa McVeigh's courage and determination made her the first known survivor of the serial killer. Could she provide enough information to find him? When police realized that Lisa McVeigh's rapist was the serial killer, the clues she provided took on a new importance. She saw the word Magnum on the dashboard of his car. Only one car had the word Magnum on the dashboard, the 1978 Dodge Magnum. A computer search of Dodge Magnum owners in the area revealed a list of 486 names. McVeigh also told investigators that her abductor used a 24-hour bank teller machine shortly before she was released. When the records of all bank machine transactions for November 4th were compared with the list of Dodge Magnum owners, only one name was on both lists: Robert Long. Robert Bobby Joe Long was a 31-year-old part-time X-ray technician. Separated from his wife, he was the father of 2 children. Since Lisa McVeigh was blindfolded during most of her captivity, she could not positively identify him from photographs. So Bobby Joe Long was immediately placed under 24-hour surveillance. Long was followed to this movie theater, and when he went inside, deputies inspected the tires on his car. On the right rear side was a Goodyear Viva. On the left rear side, the expensive specialty tire, the Vogue. Both tires were inverted.
He was kicking the clothing, kicking it. It was picking up the fiber evidence out of the floorboard of his vehicle. Fiber evidence is often referred to as a silent witness. It doesn't say a thing, but it just speaks volumes.
When told of this evidence against him, Bobby Joe Long confessed to the rape and abduction of Lisa McVeigh as well as the murders. He also confessed to 2 additional murders the police knew nothing about, and led them to the bodies. In all, he confessed to 10 murders.
It's sad what happened to him. And that I could do something like that to somebody. All the victims, all of them, you know, and you're talking about a lot of them, a lot. A lot of lives just gone right down the tubes because of me. You know, in one way or another. And it's not a good feeling. It's not a pleasant feeling. I'm not proud of anything I've done. And the worst thing is I don't understand why. I don't understand why.
Yes, it was bad. Yes, it was very traumatic to my life, but it's made me who I am today. The challenges in my life, the weaknesses that I had then, has made me a stronger, better person today. And that's how I'm able to survive.
I'm a firm believer that this is not all the homicides Bobby Joe Long did. You don't start killing the way Bobby Joe Long started killing. Have we found all the victims? No. Are we going to find all the victims? I doubt it. Not unless someday he decides to give us the rest of the information and the rest of the story.
I felt like I was in a war zone with the explosions, the smell of smoke, the smell of burning flesh, people screaming.
It was the single most deadly automobile accident in American history. 99 vehicles, most of them destroyed. 12 people died.
Identifiable?
Not at all.
More than 50 were injured.
Total destruction. If I hadn't been there and I witnessed it, I don't believe I could have believed it.
The accident happened along a 3-mile stretch of highway long known for dense, thick fog. But what was causing the fog? The victims and their families wanted answers. The accident occurred on Interstate 75 in Tennessee, on a portion of highway between Chattanooga and Knoxville. The highway was constructed through a valley which lies between the Cumberland and Great Smoky Mountains. From the time the highway first opened back in 1973, there had been numerous multi-vehicle chain reaction accidents in the same 3-mile section. The first occurred just 4 months after the highway opened. 3 people died in a 17-car pileup. 10 were injured. Just 1 month later, there was a 9-car accident. Although there were no deaths, 9 were injured. During the first 6 years the highway was open, there was an average of 1 multi-car accident each year. One of the largest was in November of 1978, involving more than 60 vehicles. 6 people were killed, nearly 100 injured. All of the accidents had one thing in common: the sudden appearance of a dense, thick fog, reducing visibility to near zero. Tennessee State Highway officials responded by installing fog warning lights to warn drivers when fog was in the area. Highway patrol officers were posted to stand watch every morning along the fog-prone area to make sure drivers slowed down when the fog warning lights were activated. The combination of these 2 systems worked. For 11 years, there were no major accidents along the fog-prone stretch of Interstate 75. But all of that changed on December 11th, 1990.
It's a massive wreck. Everybody's bumping into everybody.
I've had several reports. I've had an explosion in that area, and they're still piling up.
As I rolled down the window, I could hear the cars just crashing into each other, one after another. A motorhome hit the front end of my truck after just seconds after I had gotten out, and then vehicles started hitting the back of it. I'll never forget hearing one, and he hit other cars and just knocked them out of the way like there were nothing, and came and crashed just to the right of that motorhome. The explosion was such that it almost knocked me down.
Mike Curtis pulled this 14-year-old boy out of the motorhome, then rescued the boy's mother.
And I turned and went back to get her husband. All I could see was fire. I could smell hair burning. His coat came off burning in my hands. It's probably the hardest thing I've ever had to witness. The most helpless feeling I've ever had.
The man burned to death. 12 people were killed, 56 others injured, making it the largest vehicular accident in American history. These pictures were taken shortly after the accident, when most of the fog had dissipated.
The vehicles that I saw, I don't even know if you could classify them as vehicles. What normally was a pickup truck was 3 foot in length, body still in it.
After 11 years without a serious accident, the killer fog had struck again. But why? The families of the dead and injured demanded answers. They wanted to know what caused the dense, thick fog on December 11th, 1990. On December 11, 1990, 30-year-old Craig Piper was driving his tractor-trailer south on Interstate 75, on his way to visit his mother for the holidays. When he entered the thick, dense fog, visibility was near zero. Within seconds, he crashed.
The flames were extremely tense, and I knew there wasn't any way I could get him out. And I had to stand there and watch this man burn in his vehicle. There wasn't really anything I could do. The flames were too big. I didn't have a fire extinguisher. I just had to stand there and watch this man burn alive.
Craig Piper's mother wanted answers and hired attorney Doug Fees, who was not only a lawyer but also an engineer. She wanted Fees to find out what caused the terrible fog that was responsible for her son's death.
She said the two people in that car were killed and that her son had been burned alive in this tractor trailer, and was wondering if there was anything that I could do to help her.
The accident occurred along Interstate 75 at its lowest point in the valley, about a half-mile from where the interstate crosses the Hiwassee River. Because of its location, fog has always been common in this area. Fog is basically a cloud which forms on the ground. Fog occurs when there is too much water in the air for the atmosphere to absorb. Since cooler air holds less moisture than warm air, and cool air gathers in low-lying areas, the valley through which Interstate 75 passes is perfect for the formation of natural fog. But the fog described by the accident victims was extremely thick and dense. Was the fog on the day of the accident naturally produced, or was it caused by one or more of the local industries nearby?
On those 3 days, there was some amount of river fog, although it was relatively small. On all 3 days, there was a very noticeable emission of fog-related water vapor from the Bowater facility.
The Bowater Paper Company is located 3 miles to the east of the interstate highway. It is the largest producer of newsprint in North America and releases large quantities of water vapor into the atmosphere 24 hours a day as part of the manufacturing process. Wayne Davis recommended that the state of Tennessee conduct a more detailed study in order to understand the cause of the fogging conditions. The state decided not to fund a more detailed study, but elected to install a fog warning system along the highway and posted state troopers to patrol the fog-prone stretch of highway each and every morning. For 11 years, the system worked. Between 1979 and 1990, there were no serious multi-vehicle accidents along the 3-mile stretch of Interstate 75. The system worked until December 11th, 1990. The Wayne Davis study was an important starting point for Doug Fees. But the Davis study was conducted 12 years earlier. Fees needed to know what caused the fog on December 11, 1990. Doug Fees heard about a scientist who was using computers to track weather conditions and pollutants. Was it possible that science could recreate the weather condition on the day of the accident? Attorney Doug Fees wanted to know if the thick, dense fog on the morning of the accident had been produced naturally or was caused by one or more of the local industries, or some combination of both. To find out, he hired Dr. Alan Eschenroder, who teaches civil engineering at Harvard University. His area of expertise is risk management, and he also runs a consulting firm which specializes in air quality modeling. Eschenroder gathered weather information about the morning of the accident from the Knoxville and Chattanooga airports, as well as from 2 nuclear power plants, one only 18 miles from the scene. Weather records indicated that there were few, if any, clouds on the morning of the accident. Winds were light, and the temperature dropped rapidly the night before from a high of 60 degrees in the afternoon to almost freezing. This 30-degree drop in temperature could cause a weather phenomenon called an inversion. An inversion occurs when the temperature on the ground is cooler than the temperature in the atmosphere. This prevents air and moisture from dissipating into the atmosphere, pushing the moisture back towards the ground. Very early on the morning of the accident, a helicopter pilot flying over Interstate 75 noticed a mushroom-shaped cloud similar to this one over the Bowater paper mill smokestacks, 3 miles east of the accident site. Eschenroder believes this was visual confirmation of the inversion. Water vapor is produced naturally, coming from evaporation from lakes, streams, rivers, and ground moisture. Dr. Eschenroder calculated that the evaporation rate of the natural bodies of water in the area was only 392 gallons per day. This was barely enough to create even a light fog, let alone the dense, thick fog described by accident victims and rescue personnel. Eschenroder was convinced there had to be another source of water vapor which caused the thick fog. He noticed a series of ponds which straddled the interstate highway on 2 sides. These were wastewater treatment ponds which belonged to the Bowater paper plant. These ponds were used to clean the industrial wastewater from the paper mill. In 2 of the ponds, aerator fans would propel the water up into the air. Most of the water dropped back into the ponds. Some of it did not.
That's called drift. Drift droplets are things that drift away from the site of where they are formed. All the other droplets fall back to earth or fall back to the pond where they originate. So we had to do some original calculations in an engineering estimate fashion for emission of those droplets.
Eschenroder calculated that these wastewater treatment ponds added 10 million gallons of water vapor into the atmosphere in the 24 hours preceding the accident. Far more than the 392 gallons from the natural bodies of water. At the paper plant itself, an additional 1.5 million gallons of water vapor was being released each day from the smokestacks. But it wasn't just water vapor that was being released from these smokestacks. Paper plants released what are called particulates as waste from the paper production process. Particulates are microscopic particles which become surfaces on which water vapor can condense, and this leads to fog.
You not only had the fog potential from the presence of the water vapor, but you had a place for it to form in the surfaces of these microparticles, these condensation nuclei.
But how could Eschenroder tell if the water vapor from the Bowater paper plant 3 miles away caused the fog on the interstate highway on the day of the accident? He found part of the answer on this aerial videotape shot by a local videographer a few hours after the accident. Eschenroder recognized the wind pattern as a drainage flow which carries cooler air down into the valley. But Eschenroder needed to know in which direction the drainage flow was heading. To do that, he needed to know the exact position of the airplane. Using navigational charts, calculating the position of the sun from the glint angle off the wing and ground references, he identified the plane's position relative to the paper mill and the accident site. The videotape convinced Eschenroder that the drainage flow wind pattern was headed west from the location of the paper mill towards the accident site.
As to the cause of that accident that day, there's no doubt in my mind that the industrial fog created by water emissions from that Bowater paper mill was a major factor, the major factor, preponderantly major factor in forming the fog that caused the accident.
Attorney Doug Fees now had scientific evidence and proceeded with the civil suit he filed earlier against the Bowater Paper Company and the state of Tennessee. As Mike Curtis drove onto Interstate 75 on the morning of the accident, the sun was so strong he took his jacket off in the car. When Curtis approached the fog zone, the fog warning lights in one direction weren't working. and those in the other direction had been blinking continuously for 3 days and were ignored. The daily police fog patrols had been abandoned years earlier. Once in the thick fog, visibility was near zero. Mike Curtis never saw what he hit. Curtis heard crashes, people crying for help, the explosions.
I knelt down and asked God to help me to get through it.
He helped a young boy caught inside a motorhome.
12 or 13-year-old boy that I got out. His mother was inside screaming. The adrenaline was pumping, and I ripped the window out and got her out.
After saving the boy and his mother, Curtis tried to save the father, but he burned to death. There was also tragedy for a woman driving with her granddaughter. This is all that was left of the car.
This car was smashed completely flat like an accordion.
The car was compacted down to something in the neighborhood of 30 inches long. By some miracle, this little girl lived through the entire thing.
The grandmother died. Randall McKeon and his 2 children also suffered a loss that day. They lost a wife and mother when Judith McKeon burned to death in the accident.
There wasn't no body. She was over 90% gone. It was like she'd been cremated. And there wasn't nothing to view. She still had remains, ashes, which I'm not saying could be identified, but still knowing that she died in that vehicle. I did the best I could to get everything of all the ashes out, and I spread them across that field right out there. And I guess that was the only thing I knew to do.
Doug Fee's case was set for trial in 1994, more than 3 years after the accident. Bowater disagreed with the scientific calculations used in the Eschenroder study and hired its own scientific expert. Dr. George McVeal is a meteorologist from Denver. His study concluded that Bowater's contribution to the fog on the day of the accident was less than 1%.
Our conclusion was that the fog formed by a natural process due to mixing of moist air at different altitudes at about 9 o'clock on the morning of December 11th, after the sun had come up and heated the ground enough to start the mixing process. And that, in a very abbreviated and simplified form, is what caused the fog on that morning.
But shortly before the trial, the courts ordered Bowater to release a study it commissioned in 1979 from its own consulting firm, Environmental Research and Technology. In it, ERT states that preliminary evidence suggests that Bowater operations contribute to local vapor flux and fogging problems in the Calhoun area. Doug Fees never got the chance to prove his case in court. Before the trial, the state of Tennessee reached an out-of-court settlement with Fees on behalf of the families he represented. Because of the malfunctioning fog warning system, the state settled for $800,000 and also agreed to install a $4 million computerized fog detection system. When the fog reaches a certain density, large signs automatically notify drivers of fog in the area, and sensors trigger gates on key entrance ramps closing access to the highway. Bowater also settled out of court with 30 victims and families represented by Doug Fees and other attorneys for $11 million. Bowater continues to maintain that the paper mill and treatment ponds had nothing to do with the fog on the day of the accident. However, Bowater agreed to limit its use of treatment pond number 4, which sits near the highway.
But the issue isn't whether or not Pond 4 is a contributor to fog, whether natural water conditions that are in the community are contributors to fog. The real point is that fog exists in that particular place from time to time. It's natural fog, and the traffic control mechanisms on the highway have to be sufficient to warn motorists.
Despite the settlement and the new fog warning system, many still believe the highway is unsafe.
Warnings are never the answer when you can do better. Closure of Pond 4 is not enough to solve the problem. The chance of this happening again has been substantially reduced, but the risk has not been eliminated, nor has the hazard been eliminated.
This is only the third time I've been here. It's, and any officer will tell you that, you know, this is to me, it's a memorial site. That bridge is a memorial. Because a lot of people died here, needlessly.
The phone rang long after the office lights had gone dark, long after Georgia heat had settled into that thick, unmoving stillness that presses against windows and memories alike. And when the retired detective lifted the receiver, he did not say his name, because some instincts never retire. They only sleep lightly, and on the other end was a voice that cracked before it spoke, a voice that carried 30 years of dust and doubt, a voice that said one sentence and changed everything. I think we missed something back then. In 1992, Georgia was loud with certainty. Radios spilled headlines. Sirens cut through humid nights. The case arrived fast and violent, the kind that grips a town before anyone has time to breathe. A body found where it should not have been. A timeline that refused to align. A community shocked into whispers. Back then, it was not called a cold case. It was called urgent. It was called solvable. It was called almost finished before the evidence had even cooled. The crime scene was sealed under yellow tape that fluttered like nervous hands. Flashbulbs popped. Boots pressed impressions into red Georgia clay that would harden by morning. Officers spoke in clipped sentences, writing notes that tried to outrun the chaos. There was confidence in the air, a belief that answers were close, just beyond reach, waiting to be pulled into the light with enough pressure. Pressure was applied. Interviews stacked up. Alibis were tested, bent, sometimes broken. The victim's name spread through the town faster than the truth ever could. Neighbors looked at each other differently. Doors locked earlier. Parents pulled children closer. Everyone had a theory, and every theory felt urgent, because silence was terrifying and certainty, even false certainty, felt safer. The detectives worked the case hard and fast because that was the culture then. Solve it quickly. Calm the public. Restore order. Files filled with witness statements, timelines scribbled in the margins, photographs taken from every angle. Somewhere inside those pages, the truth existed. But it did not announce itself. It waited. A suspect emerged early, too early. A familiar name. A face that fit the fear of the moment. The narrative formed around him like wet cement, hardening with each repetition. Leads that supported it were highlighted. Leads that challenged it were set aside, labeled unlikely, inconvenient, or simply too complex for a town desperate for closure. The case moved forward, but it moved narrowly, as if walking through a hallway with blinders on. The retired detective remembered that feeling clearly, even decades later. The sensation that something did not sit right, that a detail nagged at the edge of awareness but never quite crossed into certainty. He remembered thinking he would come back to it after the paperwork, after the interviews, after the arrest. There was always time later. Except later never came. The case closed. Life moved on. Promotions happened. New cases arrived, each demanding attention, each pushing the last further into the past. The town adjusted. People learned how to speak about the case in the past tense, how to live around the scar it left behind. The family learned a different kind of survival, one measured in anniversaries and unanswered questions. They were told the system had worked. They were told justice had been served. They tried to believe it, because disbelief requires energy and grief already consumes so much. Years passed. The world changed. Technology evolved. Evidence standards shifted. What once seemed solid began to look fragile under modern scrutiny. The case file gathered dust. then was boxed, then archived. It became a reference point, a closed chapter, something new detectives skimmed without really reading, trusting the conclusions drawn long before they arrived. But memory is stubborn. For the retired detective, certain images refused to fade. A witness statement that contradicted itself in subtle ways. A timeline that only worked if you ignored one inconvenient hour. A piece of evidence logged but never fully explained. These thoughts surfaced late at night, uninvited, persistent. He told himself the same thing he had told himself for years. If it mattered, someone would have noticed. Until someone did. The call did not come from a journalist or a supervisor. It came from another retired officer, someone who had carried the case in his own way, quietly, privately, for decades. They spoke cautiously at first, circling the subject like men who knew exactly how dangerous memory could be. Then the sentence landed, heavy and unavoidable. A detail, overlooked in 1992, re-examined with fresh eyes. A tip, not new but newly understood. The retired detective felt something tighten in his chest. Not excitement. Not relief. Responsibility. Because once a question is asked out loud, it cannot be unheard. He pulled the old case file from storage, pages brittle, ink faded. As he read, the past rose up around him, vivid and unforgiving. The rush. The assumptions. The moments when speed had felt more important than certainty. One detail stood out now with brutal clarity. It had always been there, hiding in plain sight, dismissed because it complicated the narrative everyone wanted to believe. Back then, it was labeled an anomaly. Now it looked like a warning. The retired detective made a choice that night. He did not have to. He was no longer on the force. He owed the system nothing. But some debts do not expire. He contacted the department, careful, deliberate. He framed it not as an accusation, but as an obligation. A second look, a review. Just to be sure. The response was cautious but curious. Times had changed. Cold cases were no longer symbols of failure, but opportunities for correction. The file was reopened quietly, without fanfare. Evidence was re-examined under modern standards. Witness statements were reread, without the weight of old conclusions pressing down on them. The past was questioned, piece by piece. What emerged was unsettling. Timelines shifted. Alibis weakened. The original suspect's certainty eroded under scrutiny. And the overlooked detail, the one that had triggered the call, began to connect to other fragments, forming a pattern that had been invisible before. The town did not know any of this yet. Life continued as usual. But beneath the surface, something was moving. A truth long buried was working its way upward, driven not by new evidence, but by the courage to admit that the old evidence had been misunderstood. For the family, the call came unexpectedly. A polite voice. Careful words. The past reopening without warning. Hope and dread arriving together, inseparable. They had learned to live without answers. Now answers threatened to return, carrying the risk of disappointment all over again. In Georgia, under the same heavy sky that had witnessed the crime in 1992, the case stirred back to life. Not with sirens or headlines, but with a quiet acknowledgement that something had been missed, and that missing it had consequences. The retired detective understood that whatever came next would not be clean or simple. Truth rarely is. But the silence was broken. And once broken, it could not be restored. The reopening did not announce itself with flashing lights or press conferences. It moved instead through hallways and inboxes, through quiet meetings where doors were closed and voices lowered, because reopening a case is an admission, and admissions are dangerous things in institutions built on certainty. Files were pulled from shelves that had not been touched in years, boxes opened that smelled faintly of cardboard and time, and inside them lay decisions made under pressure, decisions that now had to answer for themselves. The retired detective sat alone with the records spread across a kitchen table that had never been meant for autopsy photos or witness statements. He read slowly, not like a man searching for confirmation, but like a man searching for fault lines. He noticed how often the same phrases appeared, how often assumptions were repeated as facts, how rarely anyone had written the words "we don't know." In 1992, Uncertainty had been treated like weakness. Now it looked like the only honest starting point. The overlooked detail resurfaced again and again as he read. A timestamp that didn't align. A location that should have been impossible given the official timeline. Back then, it had been smoothed over with explanation after explanation, each one plausible enough to quiet doubt. Plausible had been enough. Now it wasn't. Now it felt like camouflage. He remembered the witness who had delivered it, remembered how easily their statement had been discounted because it complicated things. The witness hadn't fit the narrative, hadn't sounded confident, hadn't spoken in clean sentences. Nervous people are inconvenient in investigations built on speed. Their uncertainty slows everything down. The detective remembered thinking, "We'll circle back if we need to." They never did. At the department, younger investigators approached the reopened case with a mixture of caution and curiosity. Some had grown up hearing about it, absorbing the version of events that had become accepted truth. To question it felt almost disrespectful, as if reopening old wounds without permission. But the file did not ask for reverence. It demanded scrutiny. They laid out the evidence as if it were new. Photographs scanned and enhanced. Logs cross-referenced. Witness statements compared line by line. Patterns emerged where none had been seen before. Contradictions that had once been ignored now stood out starkly, impossible to rationalize away. The case was no longer moving in a straight line. It was branching outward, messy, uncomfortable. The original suspect's file was examined with a colder eye. Alibis that had once seemed solid now showed gaps. Statements that had been accepted without challenge now raised questions. Why had this been taken at face value? Why had that inconsistency been overlooked? Each question chipped away at the foundation of certainty the case had been built on. The retired detective was not in the room when these discussions happened, but his presence was felt. His tip had cracked the door open, and now the past was walking through it uninvited. He knew better than to expect gratitude. This wasn't about redemption. It was about responsibility. If the truth had been missed once, it could be missed again unless someone insisted on slowing down. The family existed in a state of suspended breath. The call had been brief, carefully worded, offering no promises. Just a review. Just questions. They told themselves not to hope because hope had burned them before. But hope is stubborn. It creeps in through cracks, even when you try to seal them shut. Late at night, questions returned. What if they were wrong? What if this led nowhere? What if it led somewhere worse? In the town, nothing seemed different, but subtle shifts were happening. A detective asking questions about a case everyone thought was finished. Records requests. Quiet visits to old witnesses. People noticed, even if they didn't understand. Whispers started again, tentative, cautious, like a storm forming far away. One witness, long dismissed, was contacted again. Older now, slower, still unsure of themselves. But this time they were listened to. Their words were not rushed. Their uncertainty was not treated as weakness. They spoke about that overlooked hour, about what they had seen, about what they hadn't been sure mattered. As they spoke, investigators exchanged looks. The pieces were beginning to shift. Another witness contradicted their own statement from decades earlier. Not maliciously. Memory had changed. Details had blurred. But the contradictions mattered because they highlighted how fragile the original narrative had always been. Memory is not static. It evolves. Back then, it had been treated like a fixed point. Now it was understood as something that needed context, corroboration, restraint. Physical evidence, limited as it was, told its own quiet story. New forensic techniques extracted information that had been unreachable in 1992. What once looked inconclusive now carried weight. Not enough to declare certainty, but enough to destabilize it. Enough to justify continuing. The retired detective watched this unfold from a distance, careful not to insert himself beyond what was necessary. He understood the danger of ego, of wanting to be the one who fixed it. This was not about him. It was about letting the truth speak without interference. Still, he felt the pressure, the sense that if this collapsed, it would collapse partly on his shoulders. He thought often about the original day, the moment when the case had taken its decisive turn. He remembered the relief in the room when a suspect emerged, how tension had eased, how questions had quieted. Closure had been intoxicating. No one had wanted to disturb it. He wondered how many cases ended that way, not with certainty but with exhaustion. As the review deepened, something became clear. The case had not failed because of one mistake, but because of a series of small choices, each understandable in isolation, devastating in combination. Speed over depth, plausibility over proof, silence over discomfort. These were not crimes. They were habits. And habits, left unexamined, become systems. The family received another call. This one was different. Still cautious, still careful, but heavier. The review was ongoing. Some findings were concerning. No conclusions yet. Just transparency. Just the truth, as far as it could be known at this stage. They listened in silence, holding on to each word like it might slip away if they didn't. After the call, the house felt quieter than usual. The past pressed closer, not as a ghost, but as a presence. They realized that reopening the case meant reopening themselves, reopening grief they had carefully compartmentalized for decades. There was no turning back now. Whatever came next would change things again. In Georgia, the air remained heavy, the same kind of heat that had hung over the town in 1992. But beneath that familiar weight, the ground was shifting. A retired detective's tip had done more than reopen a file. It had forced a reckoning, not just with one case, but with the assumptions that had allowed it to be closed too soon. And as the investigation pushed forward, one truth became impossible to ignore. If the wrong story had been told for 30 years, then the right one was still out there, waiting, patient, unbothered by time, ready to upend everything once someone finally listened closely enough. By the third phase of the review, the investigation had crossed a line that no one could pretend not to see. What began as a cautious re-examination had become something more dangerous, a confrontation with institutional memory. The question was no longer did something get missed, but why was it allowed to stay missed for so long? Internal meetings grew quieter, heavier. Notes were taken more carefully. Language shifted. Investigators stopped saying mistake and started saying decision. That distinction mattered. Mistakes are accidents. Decisions have owners. A timeline reconstruction exposed the first major fracture. When events were laid out minute by minute, without interpretation, the official version simply did not hold. Too many actions overlapped. Too many movements required people to be in two places at once. What had once been smoothed into a coherent narrative now looked like a patchwork held together by assumption. One investigator, new enough to be unburdened by history, asked the question no one else wanted to voice. If this timeline doesn't work, why did we accept it? No one answered immediately. Eventually someone said, because it was close enough. That answer hung in the room, uncomfortable in its honesty. They returned to the original interrogations. Audio tapes crackled with age, voices distant but still revealing. The suspect's confidence stood out, not the confidence of innocence, but the confidence of someone who understood the rhythm of questioning, who knew when to speak and when to let silence do the work. At the time, that composure had been interpreted as credibility. Now it felt rehearsed. More troubling were the moments when questioning stopped too soon, lines of inquiry abandoned just as they became complicated, follow-ups never scheduled, leads noted, then quietly shelved. The record showed a pattern. Whenever the investigation drifted away from its chosen direction, it was gently steered back. The retired detective, watching from afar, felt a familiar tightening in his chest. This was the part he had anticipated and dreaded. Reopening a case is easy. Admitting that a system nudged itself toward convenience is not. He knew there would be resistance, not loud or dramatic, but procedural. Delays. Requests for more review. Caution framed as responsibility. The family, meanwhile, lived in a strange in-between. Friends began reaching out again, unsure of what to say. Some apologized for things they hadn't realized they'd done, accepting the official story, moving on too quickly, avoiding uncomfortable conversations. Others stayed silent, afraid of reopening something they didn't know how to face. At night, memories surfaced with sharp clarity. Small details once dismissed as meaningless now returned with weight. A phone call that felt rushed. A visit from police that ended too quickly. A question never asked. The family began to understand something painful. Closure had not been peace. It had been enforced stillness. A breakthrough came quietly, as most real ones do. A re-examined document revealed that a piece of evidence had been logged twice, once correctly, once incorrectly. The incorrect entry had been used in analysis. The correct one had been ignored. It was not dramatic. It was clerical, but its implications rippled outward, undermining assumptions that had anchored the entire case. That discovery changed the tone of everything. Supervisors were notified. Legal counsel consulted. The language shifted again, from review to potential impact. From historical interest to liability. The case was no longer just about truth. It was about consequences. Witnesses who had once been confident grew uncertain under renewed scrutiny. Some admitted they had repeated what they'd heard from others, not what they'd personally seen. Some confessed they'd felt pressure to be helpful, to say something definitive when they weren't sure. None of it felt malicious. All of it felt human. And that was the problem. The system had treated human uncertainty as noise instead of data. As these layers peeled back, a new possibility began to form, one that had never been seriously entertained before. Not just that the wrong person had been cleared, but that the right person had never truly been investigated. That the case had closed not because it was solved, but because it had stabilized. The family received another update. This time, the words "new direction" were used. No promises. No names. Just an acknowledgement that the foundation of the original conclusion was no longer sound. After the call ended, no one spoke for a long time. Relief and fear existed side by side, inseparable. In the department, a file once labeled closed was quietly reclassified. It didn't make headlines. It didn't need to. For those inside, it marked a point of no return. Once you admit the story might be wrong, you inherit an obligation to find the right one, no matter how disruptive it becomes. And as the investigation pushed forward into territory long avoided, one uncomfortable truth settled over everyone involved. The past had not been silent all these years. It had been speaking. The system just hadn't been listening. By the time the fourth movement began, the investigation had shed any illusion of neutrality. Every new step carried the weight of correction, of undoing, of unlearning. What once felt like a cold case now felt warm to the touch, alive with friction, pulsing with the quiet resistance of a past that did not want to be disturbed. The next focus was physical space. Not memories. Not statements. Space does not lie. It only waits. Investigators returned to the original locations with fresh eyes, guided not by the conclusions of 1992, but by the raw geometry of what was possible. Distances were measured again. Sight lines recalculated. Time estimates stripped of optimism. What had once been described as a short walk became 8 minutes. What had been labeled nearby required a car. The margins that had made the story convenient began to collapse. One location in particular drew renewed attention. It had always been there, noted but never emphasized. Too ordinary. Too mundane. A place people passed every day without remembering. In the original case file, it appeared as a background detail, almost an afterthought. Now, placed at the center of the map, it altered everything. Movements that once seemed fluid now looked forced. Alibis stretched thin. The puzzle shifted shape. Investigators stood in silence, letting the environment speak. Traffic noise. Wind through trees. The way shadows moved at that hour. These details had existed back then too. They had simply been ignored in favor of testimony. Now testimony was suspect. Space was trusted. Back at headquarters, analysts ran simulations using updated models. Nothing flashy, just probability. The results were unsettlingly consistent. The original theory required too much coincidence, too many perfect timings, too much luck. Real crimes are messy. This one had been made neat. The retired detective was invited in. Not formally, quietly. A call that began with, "We'd like your perspective," and ended with an unspoken acknowledgement that his instinct had been right. He arrived without notes, without expectation, carrying only memory sharpened by time. As he reviewed the new layouts, he nodded slowly. He didn't smile. This wasn't vindication. This was confirmation of something he'd carried for decades. He pointed to a section of the map. "That's where it breaks," he said. "That's where it always broke." No one argued. The conversation turned, inevitably, to people. To the figure who had hovered at the edge of the case, never quite inside the spotlight. Not accused. Not cleared. Just present. His name appeared often enough to be familiar, but never prominently enough to be questioned deeply. He had been helpful, cooperative, available. In 1992, those qualities had worked in his favor. Now they raised new questions. Background checks were run again, this time without the assumptions of the past. Patterns emerged that had once been invisible. Not crimes. Not arrests. Just behaviors. Proximity. Timing. Relationships that overlapped in ways that felt uncomfortable when placed side by side. None of it was definitive. All of it was suggestive. When investigators requested a new interview, the response was delayed, then declined, then reframed as a scheduling issue. The tone was polite, controlled, but the shift was noted. In the early 90s, he had been eager. Now he was cautious. The family was not told names. They didn't need them. They could feel the shift in how officers spoke. The pauses were longer. The updates more careful. Language tightened, as if every word had to survive legal scrutiny before being released into the air. The family understood what that meant. The case was no longer theoretical. Emotion returned in waves. Anger surfaced first, then grief, then something more complex, a sense of betrayal, not just by an individual, but by time itself. For decades had passed. Lives had been built on the assumption that the truth was known. Children had grown up with a version of history that now felt unstable. Revising the past came with a cost. Investigators revisited evidence storage. Boxes untouched since the early Clinton years were opened. Items once considered peripheral were re-examined under modern standards. Some yielded nothing. Others whispered possibilities. Fibers. Residue. Inconclusive results that had once been dismissed now gained relevance when placed in a different context. Technology had changed. Expectations had changed. The past was being judged by the present, and it was struggling to defend itself. One analyst noticed something subtle but critical. A sequence of actions that had been assumed to occur in one order could not have happened that way given the physical evidence. The only way it worked was if a key moment had been misinterpreted. Not fabricated, misunderstood. A single error, repeated enough times, had become truth. That realization hit hard. Meetings extended late into the night. Coffee went cold. No one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. Eventually someone did. "If this is wrong," they said, "then everything after it is wrong too." Silence followed. Then agreement. The case had reached a threshold. From this point forward, there would be no safe retreat to ambiguity. Every step would either reinforce a new narrative or force the department to confront the possibility that justice had been delayed not by lack of effort, but by misplaced certainty. Outside, the community sensed something stirring. Old rumors resurfaced. Conversations reopened. People who had avoided the topic for years now spoke in lowered voices, careful not to be overheard. The case had always been part of the town's identity. Now it was becoming a mirror. And as the investigation pressed deeper into the territory once avoided, one truth became impossible to ignore. The coldness of the case had never been about time. It had been about reluctance, about stopping just short of the questions that mattered most. Now, with momentum building and the past unraveling thread by thread, there was no stopping what came next. The fifth movement did not announce itself with a revelation. It arrived quietly, almost invisibly, in the form of resistance. Doors that had once opened easily now required warrants. Phone calls that used to be returned the same day slipped into voicemail. The case had crossed from curiosity into threat, and the atmosphere shifted accordingly. Investigators noticed it first in the paperwork. Requests that should have been routine were suddenly scrutinized. Old records came back incomplete. Pages were missing, not torn out, just never digitized, never indexed, never meant to be revisited. It wasn't obstruction in the obvious sense. It was something more passive, more institutional. A system built to move forward, not backward, now bristling at the idea of reversal. The retired detective watched this with a familiar unease. He had seen it before. Not in this case, but in others. The moment when momentum exposes fault lines. When reopening a file becomes less about facts and more about accountability. He didn't comment much. He didn't need to. His silence carried weight. A decision was made to isolate the timeline again, this time with ruthless discipline. Every minute accounted for. Every assumption stripped away. Investigators worked backward from the confirmed points, not the suspected ones. It was slow, painfully slow, but something began to emerge. A gap. Not large enough to be obvious, just wide enough for doubt to slip through. That gap centered around a moment long considered settled. A reported sighting. A confirmation that had anchored the entire sequence of events. It had been logged. Signed. Accepted. No one had questioned it in over 30 years. Until now. The witness was located. Older. Slower. Still sharp. When approached, they didn't resist. They seemed relieved, almost grateful, to be asked again. The memory, once firm, now showed cracks. Details blurred. Certainty softened. What had once been a definitive statement now came with qualifiers. I think. I believed. At the time. It was enough. Not proof. Not exoneration. But enough to destabilize the foundation. The interview was recorded, reviewed, dissected. Language mattered. Tone mattered. Hesitation mattered. Analysts replayed the audio repeatedly, listening not just to what was said, but to what wasn't. Silence filled the spaces where confidence used to live. The past was no longer speaking clearly. That same day, a second witness was contacted. This one had never testified, had never been formally interviewed, had lingered on the edge of the story, dismissed as irrelevant. Their recollection contradicted nothing directly. It simply suggested something different might have happened. A different sequence. A different presence. Individually, the accounts meant little. Together, they formed a pattern that pointed away from the original conclusion and toward something far less comfortable. Internally, the debate intensified. Some argued caution. Others argued urgency. Everyone understood the stakes. Rewriting the narrative would mean acknowledging that the truth had been mishandled, that people had been hurt not just by a crime, but by its aftermath. No one took that lightly. The family sensed the tension without being told. Updates became more formal. Meetings were scheduled instead of spontaneous. The words ongoing review replaced re-examination. It sounded bureaucratic, but it carried a deeper implication. The case was now under a microscope, not just from investigators, but from oversight committees, legal advisors, and internal affairs. And still, the evidence kept pulling in the same direction. A new forensic review was authorized. Items once considered exhausted were reprocessed. Advances in analysis offered clarity that hadn't existed in the early 90s. Results trickled in slowly. Most confirmed what was already known. One did not. It wasn't dramatic. No clear match. No name attached. Just an inconsistency. A data point that refused to align with the accepted version of events. On its own, it could be dismissed. In context, it became a problem. The team gathered late that night. The room felt smaller than usual. The air heavier. No one spoke at first. They didn't need to. Everyone understood what the inconsistency implied. Someone had been where they weren't supposed to be, or something had happened when it wasn't supposed to. The retired detective broke the silence. "This is the part," he said quietly, "where people start hoping it goes away." No one disagreed. The following weeks brought pressure. Subtle, but unmistakable. Questions from above. Requests to justify continued allocation of resources. Suggestions to narrow focus. To avoid speculation. To remember the limitations of memory. All valid points. All carefully worded. All missing the point. This was no longer about memory. It was about structure. About whether the case, as it had been built, could support its own weight. Community reaction intensified. Local media picked up whispers. Headlines hinted at developments without specifics. Social circles buzzed with theories old and new. For some, it was vindication. For others, disruption. The case had become a fault line again, dividing certainty from doubt. One evening, a letter arrived. No return address. Typed. Brief. It referenced a detail not publicly known. A minor element of the scene that had never made it into reports or press releases. The implication was clear. Someone out there knew more than they should. The letter didn't name names. It didn't accuse. It simply asked a question. A question that struck at the heart of the investigation. Why had a particular action been overlooked? Why had a specific moment been treated as inconsequential? Investigators traced the paper. The ink. Nothing conclusive. But the content lingered. It echoed the same unease that had been building for months. The sense that the truth had been close all along, obscured not by darkness, but by familiarity. As the fifth movement drew toward its end, the case felt poised on the edge of something irreversible. The old narrative was cracking. The new one was not yet fully formed. Between them lay uncertainty, and within that uncertainty, the possibility of reckoning. No arrests were made. No announcements issued. But internally, a line had been crossed. The investigation was no longer asking what happened. It was asking why the answer had been missed for so long. And that question, once asked, refused to be silenced. By the sixth movement, the case no longer belonged to the past. It had begun to intrude on the present, uninvited, unavoidable, pressing its weight into every conversation, every late-night meeting, every pause that lingered too long. The question was no longer whether something had been missed. That much was now undeniable. The question was who had known and when. The investigative teams split their focus, without formally acknowledging it. One track continued forward, chasing the emerging narrative, following the inconsistencies wherever they led. The other turned inward, quietly re-examining the original investigation itself. Not the crime, the process, the decisions, the moments where judgment had hardened into certainty. Boxes were pulled from storage again. Not evidence this time, but administrative files. Memos. Internal correspondence. Notes scribbled in margins, never meant for the record. The language was dated, but the tone was familiar. Urgency. Pressure. Closure. Words that looked harmless on paper, yet carried consequences that echoed decades later. A pattern surfaced. Not corruption. Not conspiracy. Something more banal and more dangerous. Assumptions reinforced by momentum. Leads deprioritized because they didn't fit. Alternatives dismissed because they complicated the story. It was the anatomy of a rush, not toward justice, but toward resolution. The retired detective watched these findings unfold with a restrained distance. When asked directly whether he had sensed this at the time, he didn't hesitate. "We were tired," he said, "and we were convinced we were right." That's a bad combination. The new theory, still unnamed, still fragile, demanded corroboration. It hinged on timing, on movement, on the idea that the crime scene, long treated as static, had in fact been dynamic. That people had come and gone, that the order of events had been misunderstood. To test it, investigators reconstructed the night hour by hour. Not just what was known, but what was assumed. They stripped the timeline down to verified actions and left the rest blank. The result was unsettling. Large portions of the night disappeared entirely. Entire windows of opportunity had never been accounted for. They had simply been filled in with expectation. Technology offered assistance where memory failed. Traffic patterns, old utility records, weather data, streetlight maintenance logs. Individually mundane, collectively revealing. The night had been darker than remembered, quieter, less predictable. Conditions had favored invisibility. A key location resurfaced in the analysis. Not the primary scene, but a secondary space nearby, briefly mentioned in early reports and then forgotten. At the time, it had seemed irrelevant. Now it glowed with possibility, access, concealment, a place where something could have happened without being seen. Permission was sought to revisit it. The request was met with hesitation, then approval. The site had changed over the years, but its bones remained. Investigators walked it slowly, measuring distances, sight lines, imagining movement in the absence of light. It didn't take long to understand how easily something could have been missed. Back in the office, tension sharpened. The pieces were beginning to align, but alignment brought risk. If the new theory held, it would not merely correct the record. It would expose it. Every step forward felt like a step closer to an uncomfortable confrontation with institutional memory. The family was informed that progress was being made. The words were careful, measured. Still, the effect was immediate. Hope returned, cautiously, like a bruise pressed too soon. They asked questions no one could yet answer. They listened for meaning between sentences. They waited. Meanwhile, the letter resurfaced. Not physically, but conceptually. Investigators returned to its phrasing, its specificity. One detail stood out now more than before. A reference to a sound. Not a scream. Not a gunshot. Something subtler. Something that would only be noticed by someone paying close attention. Audio specialists were brought in. Old emergency calls were re-examined. Background noise filtered, isolated, enhanced. Most yielded nothing. One did not. A faint, irregular sound buried beneath static and distance. At first, it was dismissed as interference. Then replayed. Slowed. Compared. It matched. Not conclusively. Not cleanly. But enough to raise eyebrows. Enough to suggest that the sound described in the letter had been real. That someone had heard something that night and had never spoken of it. Or had spoken and been ignored. The realization sent a ripple through the team. The case was no longer just cold. It was incomplete in a way that bordered on negligent. Every new discovery sharpened the same uncomfortable truth. The answers had been there. They had simply been inconvenient. External scrutiny intensified. Oversight bodies requested briefings. Legal advisors reviewed the implications. The possibility of civil consequences loomed, unspoken but understood. Still, the investigation pressed on. There was no turning back now. Late one evening, a breakthrough arrived quietly. A name surfaced during a routine cross-reference. Not a suspect, not a witness, a peripheral figure. Someone whose involvement had been documented but never explored. Their connection to the secondary location was undeniable. Their presence that night, once deemed incidental, now seemed significant. The individual was still alive. Contact was made cautiously. When approached, they did not react with surprise, or fear, or denial. They reacted with fatigue, the kind that comes from carrying something heavy for too long. They agreed to talk. The interview unfolded slowly. Words were chosen carefully. Memories surfaced reluctantly. They spoke of confusion, of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, of seeing something they didn't understand and choosing to forget it. The years had done the rest. Nothing was confessed. Nothing was proven. But the shape of the story shifted again. The night grew more crowded. The shadows less empty. When the interview ended, no one spoke for several minutes. The weight of what had been said lingered in the room. This was no longer about theory. It was about consequence. The sixth movement closed not with resolution, but with convergence. Threads once scattered now pointed toward the same center. The case was tightening, drawing breath, preparing for something final. And beneath it all, a quiet certainty settled in. The truth was no longer buried. It was waiting. By the seventh movement, the investigation stopped pretending it was exploratory. The shape was there now. Not complete, not clean, but unmistakable. What had once felt like a fog was tightening into a corridor, narrow and directional, allowing only forward motion. Every step narrowed the margin for error. Every silence carried weight. The person interviewed the night before did not sleep. Neither did the investigators. Transcripts were reviewed line by line, not for what was said, but for what wasn't. Pauses. Shifts in tone. Words chosen where simpler ones would have sufficed. It was the language of someone circling a memory they didn't want to land on. A second interview was scheduled. This time, it wasn't conversational. It was structured.
Calm.
Methodical. The questions were precise, almost surgical. The goal was not to accuse, but to pin moments in place. Locations.
Times.
Movements. The things memory resists when it knows the truth will follow. When confronted with inconsistencies, the subject didn't argue. They adjusted. When shown documentation contradicting their recollection, they didn't deny it. They stared at it longer than necessary, as if waiting for it to change. It didn't. Something broke, but quietly.
No dramatic confession. No collapse.
Just a shift. The story shortened. Details vanished. The narrative simplified in a way that felt less like clarity and more like retreat. Investigators recognized it instantly. The perimeter was closing. Meanwhile, parallel work accelerated. Financial records from the early 90s were pulled. Employment logs. Travel receipts. Anything that could confirm or contradict presence. The data was incomplete, fragmented by time, but what survived was enough. Patterns emerged. Small ones. Consistent ones. The subject had reason to be near the secondary location that night. Not incidental. Not accidental. Intentional. A witness long dismissed as unreliable resurfaced in the files. At the time, their statement had been brushed aside due to inconsistencies and personal history. Now, recontextualized, it sounded different. Less chaotic. More specific. The same sound. The same timing. The same direction of movement. They were located and contacted. Older now.
Worn.
Surprised to be called. When reminded of what they had said decades earlier, they didn't hesitate. I told the truth, they said. Nobody wanted it. That sentence lingered longer than any evidence. Investigators began assembling a composite timeline that acknowledged uncertainty instead of smoothing it over. Gaps remained, but they were honest gaps. And within those gaps, the same name kept appearing. Sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, always nearby. Pressure mounted quietly. Not from the public, not yet. From within. The realization that the case might soon cross a threshold no one could undo. That reputations would be questioned. That legacies would shift. That answers, once delivered, could not be retracted. The retired detective was brought in again. This time, not as a source, but as a witness to the present. He watched the new material unfold without comment. When asked if he recognized the name now at the center of attention, he nodded slowly. I remember him, he said. We didn't look hard enough. Those words carried more weight than accusation. Legal counsel reviewed the evidence stack. The standard was higher now. Not probable cause. Not suspicion. Proof that could withstand scrutiny after decades of erosion. Every claim was challenged internally before it could ever be challenged externally. A forensic reanalysis was ordered on remaining physical evidence. What little remained. Technology had advanced.
Technique raffinée.
Expectations tempered. Still, the lab worked methodically, aware that even a partial confirmation could shift everything. Days passed. Then a call came in. The results were not definitive, but they were directional. Consistent with the emerging narrative. Consistent enough to matter. The subject was informed that the investigation had entered a new phase. They listened without interruption. When told that further steps were imminent, they didn't ask what those steps were. They asked how long it would take. That question landed hard. Outside, the community remained largely unaware of the movement beneath the surface. Life continued. Streets filled. Stores opened and closed. The past stayed quiet, but no longer dormant. It was stirring. The family was told that the investigation was advancing toward resolution. The words felt heavier now. Less cautious. Still no promises. Just direction. They cried anyway. Not from relief. From exhaustion. The seventh movement ended with momentum fully committed. No more circling. No more testing the edges. The case had chosen its path, and everyone involved knew it. Whatever came next would change everything. And it was already in motion. By the eighth movement, time itself felt unstable, as if the past and present were no longer separate lanes but overlapping frames flickering too fast to distinguish. The investigation moved with a controlled urgency now, the kind that doesn't announce itself with sirens or press briefings, but with locked doors, late nights, and phones vibrating at hours when nothing good ever arrives. The subject was placed under discreet surveillance. Not the dramatic kind. No marked cars.
No confrontations.
Just awareness. Movement logged. Patterns noted. Silence observed. It wasn't about catching them doing something new. It was about seeing whether the old habits still lived in the body, whether the truth had muscle memory. They visited the same places, drove the same routes, paused at the same intersections. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but to trained eyes it looked like rehearsal, like someone unconsciously retracing a path burned into them decades earlier. The investigators didn't speak about it openly. They didn't need to. The nods said enough. At the lab, technicians worked through evidence with the patience of archivists and the pressure of people who knew this might be the last chance. The material was fragile, degraded, time-worn, but technology has a way of pulling whispers out of silence now. Not answers. Hints. Enough to lean forward. One analyst stared at a screen longer than usual, then called for a second opinion. Then a third. What they were seeing wasn't clean. It wasn't definitive. But it aligned. Again. The same direction. The same gravity pulling everything inward. Back in the interview room, the subject was invited for another conversation. Voluntary. That word still mattered. The room was the same, but the air was different. Thicker. Less forgiving. The questions returned to moments already discussed, but now with a precision that allowed no drift. Dates were pinned. Times boxed in. Distances measured. When the subject hesitated, the silence was allowed to stretch. When they answered too quickly, it was noted. When they corrected themselves mid-sentence, it was marked. This wasn't interrogation. It was excavation. At one point, a photograph was placed on the table. Not of the victim, not of the crime scene, of a location. Ordinary. Unremarkable. The kind of place no one remembers unless they have a reason to. The subject's eyes flicked to it, then away. Just a fraction of a second. But enough. That reaction became a turning point. Outside the room, the team recalibrated. The case was no longer about whether something could be proven. It was about how much could be shown without showing too much. About guiding the truth into the open without giving it space to run. The retired detective was updated again. He listened quietly, absorbing each development like a ledger being balanced. At the end, he exhaled slowly. "That's it," he said. "That's where it went wrong." He wasn't smiling. There was no satisfaction in his voice. Just resignation. The kind that comes when a question finally answers itself, and the answer is worse than the uncertainty. Legal strategy shifted. The language changed. Words like possibility and theory were replaced with sequence and corroboration. Every move now had consequences beyond the room, beyond the department, beyond the state. The family was told again. This time, the call was longer, the tone heavier. They were warned that the next steps might be public, that names might surface, that the quiet they had lived with for decades might soon be replaced by noise. They didn't hesitate. They said they were ready. But readiness is a fragile thing. The subject was informed that further cooperation would be appreciated. The way it was phrased made it clear this was no longer a request. They nodded, asked if they could have a moment, sat alone for several minutes after the room emptied. No one knows what they thought about during that time. Regret, fear, calculation, memory, all of it maybe, or none of it. What mattered was what came next. When the door opened again, they looked older, smaller. The posture had shifted. Shoulders slightly collapsed. The voice, when it came, was quieter. Not broken, but no longer confident. They didn't confess. Not yet. But they stopped resisting. And sometimes that's louder than words. The eighth movement closed with the sense that the truth was no longer hiding. It was standing in plain sight, waiting for someone to say its name. And everyone in the room knew that once it was spoken, there would be no silence left to return to. By the 9th movement, the investigation crossed an invisible line, the kind that isn't marked on calendars or case files but is felt in the way people speak more carefully, the way doors close softer, the way everyone understands that whatever happens next will not be reversible. The story was no longer forming.
It was solidifying.
The subject's cooperation shifted from passive to deliberate. Answers became shorter, less ornamented. The impulse to explain faded, replaced by a careful selection of words that revealed more through restraint than confession ever could. Investigators listened closely, not just to what was said, but to how often the subject checked their own memory, as if unsure which version was safe to use anymore. A search warrant was prepared.
Not rushed.
Not dramatic. Built brick by brick, supported by timelines, corroborated movements, and a growing lattice of circumstantial weight that no longer felt circumstantial at all. The paperwork moved through hands that had signed hundreds like it before, but this one lingered longer. Everyone understood the age of what they were touching. For decades of silence compressed into a few pages of legal language. When the warrant was approved, no one celebrated. There was only a pause. A shared breath, then movement. The location had changed over the years. Renovated, repainted, reimagined as something ordinary. But beneath the updates, the bones were the same. Walls remembered. Floors remembered. Investigators moved carefully, aware that they weren't just searching a space. They were reopening a moment that had been sealed too long. They found what they expected, and something they didn't. The expected items confirmed presence, ownership, access. Small, mundane details that tied the subject to a place they had claimed was irrelevant. The unexpected find was more troubling, not because it was dramatic, but because it was preserved, intentionally. Something kept when everything else had been discarded. That choice spoke volumes. Back at headquarters, the evidence was logged, photographed, secured. Every step documented. Every hand accounted for. The room buzzed with low voices and controlled motion, the atmosphere of people who know they are standing on the edge of a conclusion they've chased for years. The retired detective arrived unannounced.
No invitation.
No call ahead. He stood in the doorway, looking at the evidence laid out under sterile lights, and for a long moment, he said nothing. Then he nodded once. That would have done it, he said. Not with certainty. With recognition. The subject was informed of the search results. The room was quiet when the information was delivered. No raised voices. No accusations. Just facts, placed carefully on the table one by one. The subject's eyes followed each item as it was mentioned. Their breathing changed. Slightly faster. Slightly shallower. They asked a question then. Not about the evidence. About the family. That question landed differently. It was the first time they acknowledged another presence in the story. The first time the narrative widened beyond self-preservation. Investigators answered carefully, truthfully. The family had waited a long time. They deserved honesty now. The subject closed their eyes for a moment. Not long enough to suggest collapse. Just long enough to suggest recalibration. Outside, word began to spread internally. The case was approaching resolution. Not solved. Not announced, but approaching. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when someone walked by. Emails were reread before being sent. Everyone understood that leaks now would wound more than they would help. The family was told again. This time, they were asked to come in, not to hear details.
Not yet.
Just to be close. To prepare. They arrived carrying decades of unanswered questions in their posture, in the way they sat, in the way they watched the room like it might betray them again. They were told that the truth was close. Close enough to feel. Close enough to hurt. That night, the subject was alone. No interview. No questions. Just time. Time has a way of doing what pressure can't. It rearranges priorities. It strips away the illusion of control. It reminds people that silence, once broken, cannot be repaired. By morning, the 9th movement had done its work. The case was no longer asking who. It was asking how much. How much would be admitted? How much would need to be proven? How much damage the truth would carry when it finally stepped into the light? Everyone involved felt it. The ending was no longer theoretical. It was inevitable. By the 10th movement, inevitability had a sound. It was the low hum of fluorescent lights in interview rooms, the soft scrape of a chair pulled closer to a table, the measured cadence of voices that no longer needed to chase the truth, only to receive it. The investigation had stopped asking permission to exist. It occupied the space fully now. The subject arrived without resistance.
No lawyer yet. No demands.
Just a quiet presence, heavier than before. They sat differently, leaned forward instead of back, hands folded instead of crossed. These were not gestures of surrender, but of preparation. The body often knows what the mind is still negotiating. The questions began again, but this time they were framed differently, not as challenges, as confirmations. Investigators walked through the timeline slowly, deliberately, allowing the subject to hear their own story told back to them, stripped of ambiguity. Dates aligned, locations matched, witness statements echoed. The narrative no longer belonged to the subject alone. At one point, the investigator paused and asked a single question, not accusatory, almost gentle. Where did it go wrong? The room went still. Silence stretched, not awkward, not forced. It was the kind of silence that invites truth by removing escape routes. The subject stared at the table, at a small scratch near the edge, something they might have noticed dozens of times before, but never this closely. When they spoke, it wasn't a confession. It was a beginning. They talked about pressure, about mistakes, about a moment that spiraled faster than expected. The language was careful, defensive even, but the direction had changed. This was no longer denial. This was context, and context, once given, cannot be taken back. Investigators let it unfold. They didn't interrupt,
didn't correct.
They knew that stopping it now would fracture something that had taken decades to crack. The subject's voice wavered once, then steadied. They weren't crying. They weren't breaking. They were remembering. Details emerged, not all of them useful, some self-serving, some minimizing, but threaded through it all were anchors, specifics that matched what had already been discovered, choices that aligned with evidence, movements that explained gaps long thought unfillable. When the subject finished speaking, no one rushed to respond. The room absorbed it. Then the investigator spoke again, this time firmer. They pointed out where the story conflicted with known facts. Not aggressively, just precisely. The subject nodded, adjusted, corrected. This back and forth continued for hours. A slow calibration between memory and reality. Each pass brought the two closer together. Outside the room, legal teams listened in fragments, their notes growing denser. This was no longer hypothetical exposure. This was material, language that could be weighed, tested, used. The strategy shifted again from building a case to deciding how it would land. The retired detective was updated by phone. He listened quietly, then asked one question. Did he finally say it out loud? The answer was careful. Not yet, but close. The family waited in a nearby room. They weren't told details. They didn't ask. They watched the clock instead, marking time the way they had learned to do over 40 years, with patience sharpened by grief. As evening approached, the subject asked for water. Their hands shook slightly as they lifted the cup. Not from fear, from fatigue. The kind that comes when a burden shifts from hiding to holding. The investigator asked one final question before pausing for the night. It wasn't about guilt. It wasn't about punishment. It was about acknowledgement. Do you understand what this has done to them? The subject didn't answer immediately. When they did, the words were quiet, barely audible, but they were there. Yes, that was enough for now. The 10th movement ended without headlines, without announcements, without closure. But something fundamental had changed. The truth was no longer locked behind silence. It was being shaped, refined, prepared for daylight. And daylight, after 40 years, was coming fast. By the 11th movement, the case no longer belonged to the investigators alone. It had entered a wider gravity, pulling in institutions, reputations, and the fragile architecture of memory that had held for 4 decades without cracking. The truth was no longer a theory being assembled. It was a presence, heavy, demanding, unavoidable. Overnight, transcripts were reviewed by fresh eyes. Senior prosecutors, department advisors, people whose job was not to feel the weight of the story, but to measure it. To ask not whether it was compelling, but whether it was sufficient. Whether it would hold when stripped of atmosphere and reduced to language on paper. Whether it could survive being challenged by someone whose only task would be to dismantle it. The language mattered now. Every verb, every qualifier. Words once spoken freely were now handled like evidence themselves. The subject statements were parsed not for emotion, but for alignment. Did they contradict themselves? Did they inadvertently confirm what had been inferred? Did they close doors or open new ones? They did both. Some parts of the narrative resisted. Old instincts flared. Attempts to soften responsibility. To reframe moments as accidents rather than choices. Investigators didn't confront these directly. They let the inconsistencies sit. Sometimes, silence does more damage to a story than contradiction ever could. A second search was authorized. Narrower this time, more targeted. Less about discovery, more about confirmation. The location yielded little, but what it did yield was enough. A trace.
A mark.
A fragment that aligned with the subject's revised timeline in a way that could not be coincidental. Alignment was becoming a pattern. The subject was informed that formal charges were being considered. The phrasing was deliberate. No accusations yet. Just reality. The reaction was muted. A nod.
A breath.
The kind of response that suggests the internal argument had already ended. Legal counsel arrived shortly after. The tone shifted again. Conversation slowed. Statements shortened. The subject listened more than they spoke now, absorbing the consequences of words already given freely before caution returned. The retired detective visited one last time. Not as part of the process. Not officially. Just to see it with his own eyes. He stood in the observation room, watching through glass that reflected his own face back at him alongside the present. He looked tired, not relieved. Tired in the way people get when a question finally answers itself and leaves no room to look away. I should have pushed harder, he said quietly. No one responded. There was nothing left to say about that. The family was brought in again. This time, they were told the shape of the truth. Not all of it. Not yet. But enough. Enough to replace uncertainty with something sharper. Something heavier. Names were spoken carefully. Dates placed gently. The room felt smaller with each sentence. There were tears, but not the kind people expect.
No collapse.
No wailing. Just a slow, controlled release. Grief had lived with them too long to arrive dramatically now. It settled instead, like dust finally allowed to fall. They asked one question. Just one. Why did it take so long? No one answered right away. Because the truth was complex. Because blame did not belong to one moment or one person. Because systems fail quietly over time, through small decisions and missed instincts that don't seem important until they are everything. Eventually, someone said it. We didn't know how to listen then. Outside the building, the world continued. Cars passed. Phones rang. Life moved forward, unaware that a silence had finally broken inside walls built to contain it. The case that had once been a footnote, a forgotten file, a question mark in a dusty cabinet, was now standing upright, demanding to be acknowledged. Paperwork moved quickly now, faster than it ever had before. The machinery of accountability, once engaged, does not pause for reflection. It advances. Methodical, impersonal, necessary. The subject was informed of what came next. The process. The timeline. The loss of anonymity. They listened. Asked no questions. The weight had shifted fully now. From uncertainty to consequence. As night fell, the building emptied. Lights dimmed. Doors locked. But the case remained awake. Alive in every document, every memory stirred, every life it had touched and reshaped across 4 decades. The 11th movement ended not with resolution, but with recognition. The truth had survived time. And now that it was standing in the open, there was no longer any place for it to hide. Only a path forward. And everyone involved knew that once the final steps were taken, nothing would ever feel unfinished again. By the 12th movement, the weight of truth had begun to press outward, no longer contained by interview rooms or sealed folders. What had been private, procedural, controlled, was edging toward exposure. Not spectacle, not yet. But inevitability has a way of making even silence feel loud. The subject was formally notified. The language was careful, practiced, stripped of drama. Charges would be pursued. The case would move forward. The machinery that had waited decades to engage was finally in motion. The subject listened without interruption, without protest. When asked if they understood, they nodded once, slowly, as if agreeing with something they had known for a long time, but never wanted confirmed. The lawyer spoke next, measured, protective, focused on process now, not denial. Questions shifted from what happened to what happens next. The pivot was unmistakable. The fight was no longer against the truth. It was against the consequences of it. Outside the room, the team paused. Not to celebrate, not to reflect, just to acknowledge that a line had been crossed. Everything before this moment belonged to investigation. Everything after belonged to history. Evidence was packaged for transfer. Originals secured. Copies authenticated. The language of certainty replaced the language of possibility. Where once there had been margins and footnotes, there were now declarations. The case file, swollen with decades of fragments, finally had a spine. The retired detective was informed that charges were moving forward. He didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was quiet. "Then it's done," he said. But it wasn't relief. It was release. The kind that comes when a question you've carried longer than you should have finally sets itself down.
The family was told next.
In person. No phone call this time. They sat together, closer than before, hands overlapping on the table like an unconscious defense against what they were about to hear. When the words came, they landed without drama. No crescendo. No pause for effect. Just facts.
Solid.
Final. Charges. A name. A path forward. One of them closed their eyes. Another stared straight ahead. Someone let out a breath they didn't realize they'd been holding for 40 years. This wasn't closure. It was confirmation. And confirmation carries its own kind of grief. They asked to see the evidence.
Not all of it.
Just enough. Enough to believe. Enough to stop wondering if they had imagined everything. The request was honored carefully, respectfully. Every image, every document presented with context, with care. The room held steady as they absorbed it. No one spoke for a long time. When they finally did, it wasn't anger that surfaced. It was sadness. Not just for what was lost, but for how long the truth had waited. For birthdays missed. For lives lived in parallel with a lie. For the version of themselves that might have existed if answers had come sooner. Outside, preparations began quietly. Notifications drafted. Statements prepared. The press would come soon. The story would escape its confines and find new shapes in headlines and broadcasts and conversations between strangers. The team knew this. They couldn't stop it. All they could do was make sure the truth went out intact. The subject was returned to holding. No dramatics. No last words. Just routine. The banality of consequence is often its cruelest form. After decades of secrecy, the end arrived not with chaos, but with order. That night, someone turned off the lights in the evidence room. The shelves stood full, but complete in a way they had never been before. The past had been accounted for. Not erased, not healed, but named. The 12th movement closed with the sense that the story was no longer suspended. It was descending now, toward a conclusion that would belong not just to those who had pursued it, but to everyone who had lived under its shadow. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty anymore. By the 13th movement, the truth began to breathe outside the walls that had contained it. Not all at once. Not recklessly, but with a controlled release, like something dangerous being depressurized after years of containment. The case was no longer an internal matter. It had crossed into the world where stories are consumed, judged, misunderstood, and remembered. The first notification went out before sunrise. A carefully worded statement.
Sparse.
Factual. No adjectives. No emotional framing. Just enough to confirm what had long been denied. A 1992 case, dormant for decades, had reached a turning point. Charges filed. A suspect identified. The silence broken. By mid-morning, the phone started ringing. Journalists asked for timelines. Neighbors asked for reassurance. Old acquaintances asked questions they hadn't dared to ask in years. Everyone wanted a piece of the moment, but the moment resisted ownership. It belonged to too many people, too many years, too much waiting. The subject was transferred under protocols that had been rehearsed but never expected to be used on something this old. There were no crowds, no cameras waiting, just procedure, paperwork, doors opening and closing with institutional indifference. History moved through the system the same way everything else did. In a quiet room elsewhere, the family watched the news break. They didn't celebrate. They didn't speak. They watched the words crawl across the screen as if they might rearrange themselves into something easier to accept. They didn't. Names stayed fixed. Dates stayed sharp. The truth did not soften when exposed to daylight. One of them turned the television off. They talked then about memories that had never made sense, about moments they had second-guessed, about the way grief had shaped their lives without ever giving them permission to acknowledge it fully. The truth didn't heal those wounds, but it gave them edges, defined them, made them real. Inside the department, the mood was restrained.
No congratulations.
No applause. Only a steady forward motion as the case transitioned fully into prosecution. Investigators handed off materials they had lived with for years, watching them become someone else's responsibility. It felt like letting go of something that had defined them longer than they realized. The retired detective declined interviews, declined statements. He watched from a distance as the story unfolded, recognizing fragments of his own instincts in the coverage and cringing at the simplifications that came with mass consumption. He didn't correct them. The truth didn't need him anymore. Public reaction was uneven. Some expressed shock. Others claimed they had always known. There were accusations, speculation, armchair reconstructions built on incomplete information. The internet did what it always does. It filled gaps with certainty. The team stayed silent. Their work was done. The subject's name appeared in print for the first time connected to the case. It sat there, heavy, unadorned, carrying more meaning than any description could provide. People who had known them scanned old memories for warning signs. Most found none. That realization unsettled them more than guilt ever could. In the days that followed, preparations began for the next phase. Court dates scheduled. Witnesses notified. Statements reviewed. The slow choreography of justice resumed its ancient rhythm, indifferent to the years it had waited. The family was assigned support, not because they were fragile, but because the truth, once public, has a way of reopening wounds in unexpected directions. Strangers reached out, some with compassion, some with curiosity. They learned quickly which to accept. At night, the city slept differently. Not safer, not lighter,
just differently.
A story that had hovered unresolved for decades had finally landed. And in landing, it shifted the balance of memory itself. The 13th movement closed with a strange quiet. Not the silence of ignorance, not the silence of denial, but the silence that follows when a question is finally answered and everyone must decide what to do with the answer. The case had spoken. Now the world had to listen. By the 14th movement, the truth had settled into permanence, no longer fluid, no longer forming. It had weight now, a shape that could not be bent by opinion or softened by time. What remained was reckoning. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but slow and deeply human. The court process advanced with deliberate restraint. No rush, no shortcuts. The age of the case demanded precision, not speed. Motions were filed, responses measured, Every step carried the awareness that this story would be examined not only by a jury, but by history itself. Decades of silence had raised expectations no verdict could fully satisfy. The subject appeared smaller in the courtroom than they had in interviews. Not diminished by guilt, but by exposure. Secrets lose their power once spoken aloud. They sat behind counsel, listening as the case was outlined not as memory, but as fact. Dates spoken without hesitation. Locations described without doubt. The narrative no longer belonged to them. Across the room, the family sat together. Not holding hands. Not bracing. Just present. Their faces carried no demand for drama, no hunger for punishment. Only attention. The kind that comes from waiting so long that nothing surprises you anymore. Evidence was introduced methodically. Each piece placed in context. Not to overwhelm, but to clarify. Jurors leaned forward as the timeline unfolded, recognizing the patience it had taken to build something this old without letting it crumble. The past, once distant, became immediate. Witnesses spoke. Some voices shook. Others were steady. All of them carried the weight of time. Memories recalled not because they wanted to be remembered, but because they had never been forgotten. The courtroom held them carefully, aware that every word carried 4 decades of delay. The retired detective did not attend. He watched from home, the sound low, the screen dim. He didn't need to see the faces. He recognized the cadence, the structure, the moments where things could have gone differently. He turned the television off before the day ended. He had already stayed long enough. Outside, public interest ebbed and flowed. Some days the courtroom was full, others nearly empty. The case competed with newer stories, louder scandals. Time once again began to pull attention away. But inside those walls, none of that mattered. Justice is not measured by audience size. The subject listened as their own past was reconstructed without their control. The moments they had justified, the decisions they had minimized, all laid out plainly, stripped of explanation. When asked to respond, they did so carefully. No denial. No defiance, just acknowledgement of facts already established. The family heard the truth spoken publicly for the first time. Not whispered, not hedged. Spoken clearly, under oath. It didn't bring relief. It brought gravity. A confirmation so heavy it pressed them deeper into their chairs. At the end of one session, a recess was called. People stood.
Moved. Breathed.
The family remained seated for a moment longer. One of them looked at the empty witness stand and whispered something no one else heard. It wasn't anger. It wasn't forgiveness.
It was goodbye.
The 14th movement ended without resolution. No verdict yet.
No closing statements.
Just the steady continuation of a process that had finally caught up to the truth. And for the first time in 40 years, the truth was no longer waiting. It was being heard. The final movement did not begin with a verdict. It began with silence, the kind that settles after everything has been said, when no one dares interrupt the weight of it. The courtroom filled slowly that morning, footsteps muted, voices low, as if the building itself understood what was about to happen. Decades of speculation, rumor, accusation, and absence had led to this moment, and yet it arrived without spectacle, without music, without warning. Just a clock ticking somewhere behind the walls. The jury returned one by one, ordinary people carrying an extraordinary burden.
They did not look at the family.
They did not look at the subject. They looked straight ahead, faces fixed, disciplined, aware that whatever happened next would echo far beyond the room. This was no longer just a case. It was a correction to history. When the verdict was read, it did not explode. It landed. A controlled impact. Words spoken clearly, firmly, without tremor.
Guilty.
Accountable. Confirmed. The truth, once fragile and theoretical, now stamped into the record. No one gasped. No one cried out. The family did not move. They had imagined this moment in hundreds of different ways over 40 years, and none of those versions prepared them for how quiet it felt. Justice, they realized, does not roar. It exhales. The subject closed their eyes. Not in shock. Not in protest. In recognition. The long improvisation was over. There were no more versions of the story left to tell. The narrative had chosen its final shape, and it did not include escape. Sentencing followed later. Time was given. Statements allowed. The system moved with care, aware that punishment could never equal loss, only acknowledge it. When asked to speak, the subject stood slowly. Their voice did not rise. It did not break. It carried no drama, only a tired acceptance that surprised even them. Responsibility was admitted. Regret expressed without flourish. Not an apology designed to soften judgment, but an acknowledgement that damage, once done, does not age away. The family listened. Some stared forward. Some looked down. One closed their eyes, not to shut the words out, but to finally let them land. They had waited so long to hear something, anything, that confirmed they were not wrong to keep believing. Now belief was no longer required. The truth stood on its own. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited. Questions hovered in the air, sharp and eager. But the family did not stop. They passed through the crowd like survivors leaving a storm shelter, aware of the wreckage but no longer inside it. Their story was not for consumption. It had already taken enough from them. In the days that followed, the case faded from headlines. New crises replaced old ones. The world, relentless in its forward motion, moved on. But something subtle had changed. In the community, conversations softened. Whispers turned into statements. Children who had grown up hearing fragments now learned the full story, not as myth, but as fact. The retired detective watched the final report alone. He nodded once when the verdict was announced. No smile, no celebration, just closure. He had lived long enough to see the truth catch up to itself, and that was more than most cold cases ever offered. He turned the television off and sat in the quiet, finally released from a question that had followed him into retirement. The house connected to the case, the one people used to slow down near, the one that carried an unnamed tension, stood unchanged.
Paint peeling.
Windows dark, but it no longer held the same power. Its silence was no longer mysterious. It was just a house again. For the family, grief did not end. It transformed. The unanswered questions that had haunted them for decades were replaced by memories they could now revisit without suspicion. Photos were taken out again. Stories retold without hesitation. The victim was no longer frozen in the moment of disappearance, but allowed to exist fully again, as a laugh, a habit, a presence. Closure did not mean peace. It meant solidity, a ground beneath their feet that had been missing for most of their lives. On anniversaries they gathered, not to mourn what was lost, but to acknowledge what endured. Love had survived uncertainty. Memory had outlasted lies. Time, once the enemy, had become the witness that proved persistence mattered. The case entered archives, labeled solved, a simple word that barely captured the cost. For students, it would become an example. For investigators, a reminder. For families still waiting, a fragile hope. And for those who lived through it, it became something else entirely, not a story about crime, or justice, or failure, but about endurance. About what happens when the truth refuses to stay buried, when it waits patiently for the world to be ready to hear it. The cold case was no longer cold. It was finished. And in that finish something rare occurred. The past at last was allowed to rest.